A very good evening to everybody, and we are back with the Alumni Returns program. Today, we have with us our alumna from the batch of 2013-14, Miss Vasundhara Kolb. I welcome Miss Vasundhara.
Thank you, ma'am.
Hi, Vasundhara. So nice to have you back on the online platform. I remember you from your batch. You're one of the most, um, happening batch. I think your batch was a very happening batch. So we had so many things
Yes, it
to
was.
do, and there were so many things happening. So many of you, in fact, Parveen has been on the show, and even Suma, I guess. So, just wanted to know. An introduction to her will not be complete without telling all of you that she is a BSc in statistics with an MBA in finance, a stint in, I think, Hong Kong Bank, was it?
Yeah,
HSBC,
HSBC.
HSBC, and then she did her B.Ed, and after that she went on to do her M.Ed, in which she was a gold medalist. So that gold medalist is the topper of the university, a very proud moment for all of us at PCR. So after all this, you've done your M.Ed, taught in a teacher education. You're doing so many things. But so how do you remember your B.Ed days? Can you just talk for some time on that? How was PCR and how was B.Ed?
Yes, Sasti ma'am. Thank you. First of all, it's always a pleasure to come back to Pillai. Offline mode, online mode, climbing up those stairs. Any mode is good to be back in Pillai. So thank you so much. You especially, everyone else, Reni ma'am, that I'm getting this opportunity to interact with the current batch. Of course, when like you've already said in my introduction, I came back to studying after a long gap of 13 and a half years. So for me, I think the experience was more about getting back into student life. How do I write that first exam without my hand shaking? I still remember some of you invigilating and, that motivation to say that, you should finish the paper and, go on and finish it off the way you think best. I think those are some of the things I remember initially. And then, of course, lots and lots and lots of learning. I think the one thing I always feel thankful to Pillai about is the acceptance that Pillai has for everyone. So for me, a student who is much, much older than the rest of the class versus anyone else in the class, we're all accepted and we all find our own place in Pillai. So I think that's been my BEd journey.
Great. So today you call yourself an edupreneur and an NLP practitioner. So the NLP practitioner part I can understand. What's an edupreneur? Can you talk about that?
Yes, so I choose to call myself an entrepreneur because I now work, primarily on a freelance basis. I'm in the process of setting up something of my own, but that's a long journey. But when I say edupreneur, essentially it's any entrepreneur who's working in the education space. A teacher is an entrepreneur at the end of the day because she builds new things and new human beings every day. So I'm going to be working in the education space. There are ideas I have that I want to build, primarily to do with teacher training and impacting children through teachers. So that's why I call myself an entrepreneur.
Okay. So today, for everyone, we have a very fascinating topic. You might consider it dry, but this is something which is a part of the B.Ed curriculum, the Kolb learning styles, and it's there in the learning and teaching paper, semester 2. And for many of the students, I'm sure, like they would have just studied it as a theory and then written the answer and then maybe not known how to use it in the classroom. So that is where your alumni and your seniors will help you to be able to say how they have used this theory in the classrooms and how it can be uh, used practically. So over to you, Vasundhara, as you take us all down through how the Kolb's learning theory and learning cycle can be used in the class.
Thank you so much, Sasti ma'am. I think I have a presentation, if that can be put live. Yes. So I'm going to be talking about, like Swasti ma'am said, a relatively dry topic today, the Kolb's learning cycle, one of the theories that we learned back in the B.Ed. But what my attempt has always been throughout my B.Ed and M.Ed days is that, and after that, when I was training teachers and doing workshops regularly, is that how do you implement some of these research-based strategies? And there's been a lot of research evidence that proves that experiential learning is working. But am I able to marry my theoretical information or the 4 steps of the Kolb's learning cycle? Do I find a way of being able to implement it in the actual classroom? So I'll take you through a small exercise before we actually dive in deep into the topic, and maybe we'll take questions at the end as well. So moving on. The reason I put this up is not so that you find me on LinkedIn, which is something that you can incidentally do. The reason I put this up is because how this links up to my entrepreneurial journey and also to experiential learning. So if you've looked at my own experiences and you read up my profile on LinkedIn, I did a master's in management, did a finance and a marketing degree, moved on to do a B.Ed and an M.Ed. And then when I started working for an institution and working as a teacher trainer, I was under the impression that, will I be, using any of my banking experience or any of the skills that I learned during my banking days in the education field. And more that I started working in the field, more and more I learned that all my experiences somewhere down the line helped me become a better teacher, helped me become a better teacher trainer. And today, when I hope to give back in the form of training more and more teachers, I hope each of my life experiences is going to be valuable enough for me to learn something from them and also pass on that learning. And therefore, I call it my ikigai, or the sole mission that I have for the next, say, 30 years of my life. And I'll take you through that experience as well in a little while. So we'll move on to the little activity that I was talking to you about. Okay, so there are these 3 pictures here. One of the Civil War, 1861, one of the 1861 to 65, a picture of the Chipko movement, and since I'm based out of Calcutta currently, of the tropical cyclone Amphan. Okay, so most of you would have seen it on the news, but if you can take, say, 10 seconds to just look at these pictures and think for yourself whether you'll be able to write, say, a paragraph on each of these topics. And these are topics which children have done as part of history lessons, geography lessons, as part of environment lessons, and will do in the future as well. So take your 10 seconds. I, of course, can tell you what a terrible experience Amphan was, and therefore maybe I'll be able to write a paragraph, but you can decide for yourselves whether you can. Some of you, if you wish to share in the chat box any information that you feel that you would want to share about any of these 3 things before I ask you to do the next reflection. Yeah, so we'll move on to you doing your second part of the reflection, which is more recent, right? So virus, sanitizing your hands, pandemic, building your immunity, quarantine, and a picture which very clearly talks about social distancing. Now, I'm not going to be talking about COVID and the things that you should be doing. The question I have in mind is, if you were to even ask a 5-year-old child today, someone who is your own child, a neighbor, niece or nephew, I'm sure most of them will at least be able to give you an oral paragraph on each of these things that I mentioned here. So why is there so much of a difference between list 1 and list 2? And I'm sure for those who've learned the Chipko movement also are not going to do as good a task as they would if they were to do the pandemic. So if you think for yourselves, what's the difference? The difference very clearly is the fact that we are experiencing this. Each of us is experiencing this. Each of us is learning about a pandemic, is understanding what the word quarantine means, immunity means, and etc., etc. I'm sure if I ask you just now, and if it was a live classroom, I'd asked you 100 ways of building immunity, I would have got, yes, ma'am, all the way through, correct? And if I ask you about Chipko movement, it doesn't happen as easily. So it's about these experiences that we're going to be talking, and that's your link to the Kolb's learning cycle, how important experiences are for everyone's learning. And therefore, you could be a primary school teacher, you could be a middle school teacher, you could be secondary, college, wherever. Your students will learn from their experiences. We'll move on to the next bit, please. Yeah, so this is how the experience journey is going to look for, say, the next 40 odd minutes. We're going to be talking briefly about a topic called metacognition. That's again a topic in psychology which you would do or would be in the process of doing shortly. But we'll really look at it from an actual classroom perspective and from a personal perspective as well. We then move on to talking about, and I love acronyms, I love stories. You'll realize that in a short while. So we're going to be doing the 4W plus H on experiential learning to really know the what, when, how, why, all of that about experiential learning. And hopefully from this experience that we build, you will be able to take back learnings and be able to apply that into your current classrooms, your own learning in your B.Ed classrooms, and your future classrooms where you become teachers. I will end then with reflections, because that's a very, very big part of the experiential learning cycle. So when I say metacognition, we are really talking about thinking about thinking. Sounds like a complex concept when it's put like that, but it's really about, for example, I'll share a personal experience. Up until college, when my parents were deciding how I should study, I was really learning in a silent room with full concentration. I was told that you're supposed to make notes in a particular way, you're supposed to have a glass of water next to you, you should be seated against the light and all of that. So there's a whole lot of ways in which I got instructions for how I must learn. Okay. Slowly, when one becomes independent and you become a thinking youth, thinking young adult, okay, you are able to think for yourself and say, okay, how am I processing information? How am I thinking about my thinking? So I've put up a little definition, and then I'll tell you what I did in college. Okay, so metacognition is really thinking about one's own thinking. To put it simply, it's about planning, it's about monitoring, it's about assessing and figuring out whether something is working for you or not working for you. Okay, so back in college, therefore, when I said, now I'm going to learn in the way I think best, I discovered that I could learn best with an FM radio in the background. I'm sure a lot of you who follow that same process would have a smile on your face just now. And for those who are the walkers, the talkers, the jumpers during your study process, and when no one else gets it that you are still studying, you will have a smile on your face as well. So it's about figuring out what works for you, what is the way in which you're going to learn best, what is the way that is continuing to work for you. So this goes back to a story in Pillai. I told you that I came back to studying 13 years down the line. I had a 5-year-old son when I came back and did my B.Ed. And you can only imagine what plight you would be in with a 5-year-old son and a 1-year B.Ed, where everything is done at breakneck speed. Okay, and you're coming back to studying after 9 years. But the fact that I could study with music on, the fact that I could, concentrate using music is what I used to my advantage. So I would put music on in the background. I would have my son dancing in one corner of the room, and I would go back to studying Swasti ma'am's notes, or I would go back to studying Reddy ma'am's sociology. Yeah, so that's how I did it. I haven't told them still, but yes, that's how I did it. Okay, so that's really how metacognition works. And the reason I'm talking about metacognition is because that's how experiential learning works. So if you are able to connect your experiences, if you believe that every experience that you encounter in life is going to teach you something, and at the moment I'm talking self, we're going to move into the classroom. But for now, I'm going to talk about me as an individual. If I believe that every experience is going to teach me something, I'm definitely going to learn from that experience. Then I believe that that experience can be modified, can be bettered, and I will learn something more. I continue that cycle, and that's how your learning takes place as well. So very quickly, a little more about metacognition. This is your cycle, like I was mentioning. So this fellow here also believes in music. But the cycle that really works in metacognition is that you assess the task at hand. You evaluate what are your strengths and weaknesses. So you figure out what's going to work for you, what's not going to work for you under the circumstances of that given task. Then you have a planned approach. So you say, okay, let me try step 1, step 2, step 3, or activity 1, activity 2, activity 3. I apply that strategy. So I'm not scared of applying a strategy that might fail totally, right? I reflect if it worked well. Can I do a rating scale and say, okay, it worked 0 to 5, 5 to 10 for me, or it was just perfect? If it's perfect, I can again assess my next task, and the next time I know what strategy is going to work for me. If it is not, I modify that. So if music doesn't work, or something is, or rock band doesn't work, maybe Arijit Singh is going to work, okay, or Kailash Kher is going to work. But that's where you have to figure out what experience is going to work for you. And now if you could just shift gears and move into the classroom, okay. So every child is going to learn from what you create in the classroom as a creator, what experience you create in that classroom, because every child is then going to do this process and do this cycle. Of course, for the younger ones, you'll have to get them used to doing this process. So we're going to talk about that in a little while. So we move on just to tell you how the metacognition continuum works, right? So in the continuum, and you don't have to bother about the small writing, it is only representative. Essentially, you could have a child in your classroom who says, if you've asked him, okay, him or her, do you know the difference between goods and services? He'll say, maybe, or maybe not, or no, I don't know it, right? There could be another one who says and gives out a blurted answer and says, I think goods is this, services are these, right? He's not really processed it. The first thought that comes into their mind is the thought that comes out. And as most teachers, we're going to say, what rubbish, you've not thought through your answer, okay? What we don't understand is that even that process is a process which the child has taken effort for, and that is based on the experiences that the child has had. So if you as an English teacher are asking them to write an essay on the visit to Disneyland, and there are 50% of your students who've not been to Disneyland, okay, what are the kind of answers do you expect? The same thing is for when you teach more complex topics, right? Children haven't seen something, they've not heard of something, okay, they've not figured out what that something or that difficult topic means. Today, you might find Kolb's cycle easy to understand because you've heard it in a lecture, you've been through 3-4 lectures, but I'm sure someone else who's watching this video who has no clue about theories of learning may not find it as engaging or as interesting, right? So the same thing moves on, and when you go on to higher order thinking, you are then able to find that child or create that child, right, who is able to think through, rationalize, find differences between, differentiate between goods and services also. And you could have a child on the other end of the spectrum who's not even able to give you a definition of goods and give you a definition of services, right? So that's the continuum that you are on. But the reason why it is a continuum is that you have to understand that this is not valid for all children at all points in time. Back in school, I was terrible at physics numericals. I was good in physics. The theoretical concepts of physics I understood, or rather the practical experiments also I understood, but numericals was just not my thing, right? So for physics numericals, I could be on the leftmost side of the continuum. But for, say, English or literature, I was very, very fond of it. I could be on the right-hand side of the continuum. And that's the play that you have. And that's what you have to move around in your classroom for the experience in the classroom to work. If you've taught at an average level of performance and you are giving out information at an average level, you will leave out two sets of children on either side of the continuum. I'll leave you with that thought and we move on. So I'm going to move on to experiential learning, which is what the topic is. You'll say, I've come now onto it. No, you will realize that each of the things that we've been talking about are experiences that we are building. So keep those thoughts and let's do a quick revision on the Kolb's learning cycle itself. So everyone into education will be familiar and fond of John Dewey. I used to particularly like him because of the way his name sounded. But he's the first one who actually spoke about the need for learning and experiences. So he spoke about learning through experiences, and then a more structured approach was what Kolb's cycle talks about. So Kolb's cycle is a 4-step process. Quick revision for those of you who may have forgotten some of the terminology. You start off mostly, and that's why I'm saying mostly, because I'm going to tell you where the difference comes up. You start off mostly from a concrete experience. From that concrete experience, you reflect. So today, for example, we started off with the concrete experience of feeling about a pandemic. I could have also played a video if we were in a live class, and then I would have actually given you a concrete experience. I made you reflect and think about some questions that you need to answer. So those are your reflective observations. Okay. Now, from those reflective observations, you may come to a few abstract concepts. You may say, okay, I think experiential learning means this, can mean this, may mean this, right? Some of you may have figured out that we're going to be talking about experiences and therefore it's connected to emotions. Some of you may say we're talking about experiences, so therefore it's related to kinesthetics. But there are various ways of connecting, and everyone may have reflected in a very different way and therefore may have a very different abstract conceptualization from that. Now, once you've been through these 3 steps is when you actually come down to applying it in the classroom first, and then being able to apply that learning in the real world. So when you go, for example, you're all old enough to be learning driving. If some of you have gone and learned and done a driving test, that's the bit that is happening, right? You do get the concrete experience because you're actually going and driving. Then you go and reflect every day. You go and figure out, you discuss with your trainer, etc. What was I doing well? What was I not doing well? You find you figure out your own abstract concepts and say, okay, if I move the gear like this, if I'm sitting in an upright position, if I do a reverse gear, that's working for me, not working for me, etc. And eventually the practical application is, are you going to go and bang up your car, or are you going to be able to drive? Okay. If you're going to move this into the classroom, that's what we're going to be talking about next. And the fact that this is not a fixed cycle in the way it appears to be. Yeah, so it's not restrictive actually. So we'll move on to doing Kolb's in a slightly more detailed version, right? So when I'm doing or going through an experience, that's my feeling component, right? I'm feeling a set of emotions when I'm going through an experience. All right. So yes, so very true with respect to a lot of subjects, and we'll talk about that in a little while. Is it true only for the sciences, or is it true for the other subjects as well? Right. So when I'm experiencing, I'm going to be experiencing a concrete experience. I reflect upon that. I'm going to be forming an abstract concept, and then I do active experimentation. Okay. I'm going to demystify this a little bit. Okay. It doesn't necessarily mean that all of us on the face of this planet follow this cycle in exactly this structure and format. Okay, so maybe I'm a less kinesthetic person, and maybe I am going to be a more thinking kind of person, and therefore I reflect more than I do, right? So I could be entering this cycle at any point of this cycle. Okay, but the beauty of this cycle is that if learning is to happen, all four of these elements have to take place. So if I reflect and I think that, okay, this is an important topic for me to do, or I reflect and I find out that I want to find out more about this topic, maybe I want to do more reading, right? So it doesn't mean that reading is not an experience that I'll have. Based on my reading and reflections, I might have an abstract conceptualization. Based on that abstract conceptualization, I will go and try out something in class. So in class, if I've supposing read about a particular pedagogy which works, so maybe cooperative learning strategy or inquiry-based method, and I want to go and apply that in my next practice teaching class. Okay, so I'm going to reflect. Can I do it? Can I not do it? I will read up, have an abstract concept, and figure out that, okay, I think I've got it. I'll go and experiment in class, right? Or maybe I'll experiment first in front of the mirror and then actually experience the feedback from the students. That feedback mechanism in that actual classroom experience is then going to teach me. So for educators, you have to understand that all these four have to take place, but all these four need not take place in the exact same way. It's a cyclical process, right? So what is also highlighted is that there will be different learning styles. And those learning styles play in the way in which you will actually use this learning process or actually implement this learning process. So I'll give you like a 5-second reflection time. Put yourself first as the student in your B.Ed class. Then put yourself as a future teacher, okay? Or for those of you who have children, think of how your children react to their teachers, okay? They do have teachers whom they, have better experiences with, and teachers whom they come back and crib and say, aaj kuch nahi padhai hui. We've not understood a thing in what is happening in ma'am's class. And the same thing is going to go back full circle when you pass out and you become future teachers, that have you provided the exact experience or not? Yeah. So we move on. Who should use the experiential learning pedagogy? And I'll give you both the questions together. So who? Only primary school, middle school, or secondary? And we do the next question as well together. So you have to think about this. Can only young children do it? Is it valid for the secondary as well? Which subjects should use this pedagogy? Only biology, only physics, because they are the sciences, so most naturally you can have experiments in them? Or can you think of ways of providing experiences for history lessons, geography lessons, English lessons as well? Right? Now my answer is in my next slide. So why must you actually use the pedagogy for all subjects or all students? Okay, so whether it's a young child, an older child, or you are teaching biology, physics, chemistry, economics, anything, can you use the experiential learning? So if we can move on to the next slide, please. Yeah, so for me, the answer that I like giving is that you can use it for all students and all subjects, right? Now you have to think about why you can use it for all students and all subjects, and how by nature and by its construct, the experiential learning cycle is an inclusive concept. So it is meant to serve the needs of children on all sides of the metacognitive continuum. It is meant to serve the needs of all subjects and can actually work for all subjects. So we'll talk about that as well. We move on. Yeah. So the reason why experiential learning works for everyone and for all subjects is because of the nature of the pedagogy itself. In its foundation, it is very interdisciplinary in nature and constructivist in nature. to put it simply, essentially it is assuming that everything that you learn is going to be a build on based on what you've learned previously, right? So whatever is your previous knowledge, everything is going to come and sit on top of that. You might change your previous knowledge, modify your previous knowledge, but then again, you will have your new set of experiences and you will move on. Subjects are not walled. So we teach them as physics, geography, chemistry. The real world doesn't work like that, right? So if I'm doing cooking, I'm applying chemistry, I'm applying aroma therapy because I'm looking at how the food looks, how the food smells. I'm also applying a lot of physics because I'm looking at temperature, I'm looking at latent heat. I'm figuring out that if I heat olive oil versus refined oil, is there a different flame I need to put, right? I'm using a very, very daily life example, and you can think of many, many more for yourself, but real life doesn't work in compartments. So why do subjects have to be taught in compartments, and why do experiences have to be taught in compartments? Why can't you have a PT teacher doing a basketball lesson in school and the physics teacher tying up trajectories with that same topic, right? So that's the bit that you talk about experiential learning, that you have to believe that subjects, while yes, you are a subject matter expert, you do teach that given subject, but the child can have multi-level experiences. The outcomes for different learners is different, and that's what experiential learning believes in. Every learner can have a different experience, right? Learners play a critical role in assessing their own learning. This goes back to our metacognition. If I, as a learner, can figure out that I haven't understood, right? And that's going to be true for the youngest child in your school, the oldest child in your school. If a child has not understood, they are able to figure out that they have not understood, which is why you have children disturbing you in the classroom, which is why you have children not paying attention to you in the classroom, because actually they're seeking attention. So that's the most inherent pedagogy that experiential learning comes with, that you are going to believe that every child is going to be able to assess their own learning. You are going to be of the belief that every learner will have a different experience from that same learning, from that same experiment. Different children will take away different things. From my YouTube live session today, different people are going to take away different things. I'm sure if Sasti ma'am at the end of the session asks, there'll be different people who say what they heard or what they didn't or what they missed. So we'll move on to the second reason why experiential learning works for all subjects. It works for all subjects because that cycle does not end in a circle. That cycle is actually a spiral. Okay, so you're going to go through an experience, you're going to reflect, you will have your conceptualization, you will actually do practical experimentation and keep repeating that. So every time you keep building on, spirally, your knowledge depth keeps increasing. And that's what makes it work for everyone. So maybe someone has moved from the bottom of that spiral to level 3. Someone moves to level 6, someone moves to level 8. It works for a level 8 learner. So it works for a very, very gifted, mature learner. It works for a child who can contribute to the learning experience. So you've created a field trip and you have a child who's read up about the mangroves and the environment issues that mangroves are going through, and how they have to be preserved, and how Godrej is helping them preserve. So when you go for a field trip to the mangrove forest, you will have a mature learner sharing that experience, right? Similarly, there could be a child who doesn't have that exposure, right? Will learn from the experience of seeing something, from hearing something, from doing a little experiment in that mangrove forest. And you will also be able to help a learner who has trouble learning, who requires scaffolding, who requires support. Because the support will come in not only from you, but will come in from the peers, from all the sharing that happens, from all the team learning that happens after the experience has actually been gained, right? So any learner who can benefit from these hands-on examples. I've also worked very closely for special needs and inclusion, and therefore, one of the basic strategies that are told for children with ADHD or learning disabilities or autism is the fact that you do need to provide concrete experiments. They have to learn in a more concrete fashion rather than a topic being very abstract. So most naturally, you will be a teacher who will be able to include everyone in your classroom because you've already planned in a way that you will be able to execute an inclusive lesson. So remember, it's a spiral. It is never ending, and we can move on to the next slide. So how do you actually do this, right? The two things that you have to accept and remember that there's a lot of planning and that you need to do. But once you've planned and you've planned every single part of the experience, you've planned how you're going to form groups in the class, you've planned what the actual activity is going to be, you've planned how you will give evaluation feedback to the children. You have to plan every step of the way and then believe that it's okay to have an organized chaos, right? Because they're interlinked. You don't have the acceptance for having an organized chaos. You're going to struggle with the experience that happens of a confused lot of children doing group work for the first time. But if you've planned it well enough, if your instructions are crystal clear, if you know exactly what activity you want to do, if you are able to facilitate that effectively, that's where that experience counts. And that experience is therefore not just the topic you're going to be teaching, but also about what you actually want to give to the students. So we'll move on to some of the strategies that now I've put down a whole lot, a list of strategies. A lot of you are going to do a screenshot of this, and which is why I listed them down like this. But the one belief that you must have is that you will be able to think of many, many, many thousands of more ways of doing this. Okay, simple ways of doing this, of course, are debates, are mock trials or mock sessions, mock discussions. You can organize visits. Now you're going to say, okay, Corona technology, how are visits going to happen? Go look up on Facebook. There are lots of virtual visits to New Zealand happening and lots of virtual visits to Australia happening. So where there's a will, there's a way. I think the pandemic has told us that there's a solution to everything. And therefore, whether they are school camps where you have planned activities for children doing their work automatically, community service activities. Pillai does that beautifully. We were all part of community service activities. Yeah. And every film that you can make the child watch, every video that you can make them watch, any simulation activities, right? Any simulation activities. Experiments, the science teachers do that, but for the history, geography teachers and any other subjects, role playing is a very good way of ensuring that you are able to provide that same experience. So children can actually have an interaction based on the role play. They can actually play various characters of those times. Ditto for an English session, etc. So a lot of the ways in which you would have been now recently interacting with your teachers and they would have used these tools would be the Kahoot, the Jamboard, the Socrative, various gamification apps that are available. So those are ways in which you can, of course, do it online. So just because you're doing an online class doesn't mean that the experience cannot be created. The idea is, how do I create an experience so that the child is able to learn himself from that experience, assess their learning from that experience. And I will point out at this stage that the reason why you need to do this is not to make your activity interesting. Okay, so you're not making your lesson interesting. You're doing this because the future skills that students need to learn are these skills. Tomorrow, if they need to assess their teammates, or they have to talk in a group, or they have to collaborate, these are the skills you're going to teach them. So we're going to move on. Hopefully, you've all taken a click. Now is the big thing that all troubles us. If I'm going to do an activity, how am I going to evaluate? Can I do this? No, I can't, is the most common answer I get, right? Because we've all been used to marking our papers out of 10, okay, 20, 30. So I know if I have to give a 30 mark paper, how do I mark 28? How do I mark 25? How do I mark 15? Okay. The problem is that when I'm doing an activity, I don't know what children are doing. They're having some fun, but I have no clue how to evaluate them. Okay. So there are a whole lot of things that I've mentioned here again. But the one thing common that you have to remember is the rubrics. Okay, so the important thing that you do as so like Sherry says, at PCR we do a lot of these things. When you are doing evaluation, remember the most important part. So if you've not done blueprinting already, pay extra attention to the sessions that you do on blueprinting, because if you are able to build a solid rubrics of how you evaluate each of your children through an activity and get them to help you build that rubric. Okay, so I'm almost at the end of my presentation. I'll end with a short story before I take you through the last bit. My son was 5 when I was at Pillai, and because he was troubling me around and I'd just been through Mary Ma'am's reinforcement and psychology and behavior modification session, I decided I had to make a chart and a star chart, right? And then we said, how are we going to decide criteria? So I put him on the task of deciding the criteria as well, with the full assumption that he's not going to come up with criterias. 15 minutes later, I was surprised he came up with criterias which were better than what I would have thought of. And one of them was that I can't get angry with him till I've reminded him 5 times about a particular thing. So it worked well for both of us, because as soon as he was at the 4th, he would run to do the task. And so it works well. Children are able to self-evaluate. I move on to the last bit now and then wrap. Like I said, rubrics, you do have to think of matrices, very clear, crystal clear matrices, and you can do them with smileys for the younger children. You can do them with specific criteria, but be very clear what you are evaluating the child on pre-activity. You can't be thinking this after the activity, because then your design for the activity is not going to work. Yeah. We move on. I end with this last quote from a person I admire a lot. I read about a lot. So this is Dr. Sugata Mitra. His most recent book, of course, is The School in the Cloud. And the one thing that he constantly reminds us is that don't teach children what they can learn themselves. Right? So in the technology world, where there's so much information available, when a child can Google and find the information, don't try and teach them information or skills which they can pick up themselves. Create experiences, create life experiences which will be helpful for the future, and skills that they will learn for their future jobs, and not for giving an exam. So that's the reason, and that I count full cycle. That's the primary motivation for doing this topic, and actually wanting to do a dry topic and trying to turn it into real life. So I'm done with what I wanted to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vasantara. Thank you really for putting things in perspective. I'm sure that when anybody goes back and hears you, sees this again, they are really going to look at the theories that they have and see how do we use this in the classrooms. And we need the alumni like you who will come back and tell them that these theories work, because these theories do work. In fact, when you were talking about your son coming up with these criteria, I remember doing the same when my children were young and they had to bargain for their internet time. So they had to do a
Yes.
lot of duties, if they did this, they got 5 minutes, and if they did that, they got 10 minutes. So they had to decide all that.
Correct.
Yeah. So they come up with things they could do or not do, and then even tell me other ways they could earn time
Yeah.
for games. Okay. So we are opening up for questions if anybody wants to ask. But on my own, I would like to ask you, when you use rubrics in class for a experiential learning, what kind of things do you really look for and evaluate?
So pretty much when you are, say, setting up the activity, you would know the various starting points, your middle component, and the end of the activity, right? So if I were to give you an example, if my experiential learning activity is that they do a group work, and they are then going to do a group presentation after that. So I've given them a topic and they are presenting after that. My typical ways of evaluating would be how cohesively they've worked in that group, whether they've been able to identify the roles that each of the students had in that group. So what was the group dynamics, and whether the presentation, or, so usually when you do a presentation and you ask the students to present, you've also not given them a structure. So if you've given them a structure to say, okay, I need you to follow this structure, I need you to tell me about Australia, I need you to follow natural vegetation and all of that, have they been able to do sufficient research and back up that research? Okay. And similarly, the presentation skills itself. Are they being able to support each other in that presentation if someone messes up? Today I was alone, right? If there is a group work and there is a backup plan, is there an initiative taken up by a co-participant to answer a given question or not? So you're going to look at each of those elements and try and put in those in the rubrics. So you'll look at the way they present, you look at the way they have actually been through the process.
Do the students really know about the rubric beforehand? Do you tell them the rubric?
It's a very good idea to tell people what they're being evaluated on. I've always seen it work better. So if I've saved even for a college assignment, so for example, I was teaching a special needs session at the Christ. The assignment where we gave the rubrics, they know exactly what they're being evaluated on, the quality of output that you get, and yet you can leave off a little 5 minutes off for them to get creative. So you can have those balanced 5 marks on the miscellaneous aspect. So the spark that any one group gives you, and you can have those 5 marks in your hand, or those 5 things, what is it called when Badsha talks about it, saying, that X factor. So you can leave marks off for the X factor, but if they know majority, so if it's a 25 mark assignment and they know 20, it's good to go. And it's a very, very good idea for students to know the rubrics, is my take on it. People may have different opinions, but experience-based, it always works better.
So I guess that brings us to the end of today's evening. Thank you once again, Vasundhara, for a wonderful talk on such a topic.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So bye-bye. It was really an enriching session. Yes.
Bye-bye. Thank you. It's always good to be a Pillaiite.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.